All right, should I begin or?
Please do, Susan.
Okay, please. So thank you so much for having me here today. And I know there'll be, I'll watch in the chat box to see if questions come up. I know we've got time at certain times for questions as well, but I want this to make sure that this is information you need, and where there's something I've said that either seems confusing or concerning, I want you to ask away. So as we've said, we're going to talk about the College and Career Readiness Standards for Adult Education. And this is just a cover of the report. You can get it off the web. You can just Google it and get it off the web if you want to read all about it. And it really just I did facilitate the process. We did have two panels working, one in math and one in English language arts literacy, and they were made up of adult educators, college faculty, some career technical folks who took a look at the Common Core state standards that had just sort of come off the presses to say, well, what is most relevant and important in the Common Core standards for our adult learners. And that's how we came up with the College and Career Readiness Standards for Adult Education. So the first thing I want to say is, because we get lots of questions about, well, what are they and what are they not? So first, what they're not. So, and this is really important because I think that sometimes when instructors or others might look at a set of standards, they can get concerned. And so the first thing is they're not in order in which to be taught, and there are not directions about how instructors should teach the content. And they're not a full spectrum of support and interventions for students. And that's important if you think about your English language learners. Well, yes, you can use these standards with them, but what supports would they then need in addition to make sure that they have access to the content you want them to have? They're not a curriculum. Again, that sort of gets to the notion of them not being how to teach, and so they need to be complemented with high quality curricula. And they're not a national or federal set of mandates, and that's really key here. No one in the federal government is saying anyone must use these. These are really used as a model of evidence-based college and career readiness standards for use by state and local adult education programs. I thought it might be helpful to let you know how some states are using the CCR standards, because they're using them in a variety of ways. So some are just saying, we're going with the CCR standards. You know, we like them, they make sense to us. Our standards are now at that point where they were outdated and we needed a new set, so we're going with those. Some are adopting the CCR standards, but then they're adding in other content that they feel is important, that they might have had in their previous standards, or they feel in the teaching of adult students that additional content is necessary. Some are putting the CCR standards in their own words. In other words, they use the CCR standards as a model, but they had teams of instructors and college faculty from around the state to actually work on their own set. Some are taking their existing state standards and then making sure that, and I'm going to go over the key advances in both English language arts and math, so you know what they are, just to make sure that those key advances are actually represented. And some have actually adopted the Common Core state standards themselves, and then they're using the CCR standards to tag as priorities the CCR content, because the CCR standards for adult education are a subset of the Common Core, and so they're using the CCR in that way. So first I'm going to get into the CCR standards for adult education and ELA literacy. And I want to talk to you about the advances, and I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on each one of these. But the first one is complexity. It's regular practice with complex text and its academic language. Second is evidence, so that students are reading, writing, and speaking grounded in evidence from text. You can think about that in your own lives, about how you use that in the work that you do. And then knowledge, building knowledge through content-rich informational text. That not only, part of the reason we read and write and speak and listen is because it's a way for us to learn about things that are interesting and important in the world, but also the more we know, the more we're able then to understand. I just want to show you that the ELA literacy advances build toward college readiness for all students, so they're connected. So as students engage with complex text and they extract and employ evidence from that text, then they're able to build knowledge. And so there's a way of thinking about them as being connected. So I'm going to get into a little bit of detail now about the first advance on complex text and its academic language. The first thing I wanted to show you was, I just thought it was interesting that way back in 2011, there was sort of this flat line. No one was talking about text complexity. No one was looking at text complexity. It wasn't Google, and it became one of their top Google searches, as you can see by this chart. So the notion of text complexity has now become something that a lot of people are looking at, paying attention to. Publishers are paying attention to it, assessment developers are paying attention to it, instructors are paying attention to it. So why are we bothering with text complexity? Well, one of the things that when we were doing the search, and I should tell you just as I don't know if this is a disclaimer or what, but I led the writing of the ELA literacy standards of the Common Core. So some of this was some of the original research that we looked at when we were figuring out what would be the college and career readiness standards for adult education. We went back to look at some of the evidence that was there from the Common Core. So the bottom line here is that there's a gap between what a lot of high school text reading there is versus college level reading. And high school textbooks have declined in all subject areas over the last several decades. The average length of sentences has declined. Vocabulary demands have declined. So you see here that what was a former fifth grade text is now an 8th grade text, and what was a former 7th grade text is now a 12th grade text. There's about a 4-year difference, and we have a whole lot of students who are graduating and earning, you can imagine earning GEDs that come in with this gap. And because of that, then they end up in remedial courses, which is not what we want, because we know that the whole point is that a lot of students don't ever finish their college careers. So, and I should say that it's about more than 50% of students that are sort of taking, all the courses they need to take, earning their degree in whatever way they're earning their degree, are finding that they've got a real gap in their complexity. And there's something called the ACT Reading Between the Lines study, and that's the one that showed that it was most consequential. So what we found is that what those ACT studies found is that what students can read in terms of its complexity is the greatest predictor of success in college. And the gap is huge, as I sort of showed you in the last slide, of about 4 years. So what this means, if you think about it, is if you thought about Marcella and I, and you think that both of us can find the main idea, and both of us can determine what the author's claim is, and whether the reasoning and evidence is sound. But I end up in a remedial course, and Marcella ends up in a freshman course in college. The difference between us is that Marcella can find the main idea and the author's claim, etc., in a complex text, in a college-level complex text, and I cannot. And that's really sort of the gist of what the ACT study found. It's not that finding a main idea isn't important, but it's the ability then to really suss it out in a complex text. And as you can see, less than 50% of graduates can read sufficiently complex text, and that is hamstringing them. So the standards include a heavy focus on complex text. So what are the implications for instruction then? So one is that the CCR standards have raised the bar for what students should read and understand at each level. The passages that students should be reading should be high quality, so they're worthy of close reading, so students are really able to spend some time on the text that they're asked to read. And there should also be sustained focus on building students what we call academic vocabulary contained within those complex texts. All of us who have worked in the area of reading know how key vocabulary development is. And there's something called academic vocabulary. Some of you may know it by what they call Tier 2 vocabulary. And those are words like dedicate and allocate and necessary, words like that appear whether you're reading a text in history or science or the arts or in literature. And so I was once someplace and someone called them the money words, because if you can learn the academic vocabulary words and you have a good vocabulary, you're going to be able to access complex text. The second advance to think about when you think about these standards and pay attention to is this focus on reading, writing, and speaking grounded in evidence from text. So what do we mean by that, and why is it important? So the reason it's important is you just, as I said, you sort of think about your own life, about most college and workplace writing or thinking, you could even say, requires evidence. You're asked to read something, then you're asked to maybe read a couple of things, synthesize what you've read, talk about the implications of it. And the ability to cite evidence differentiates strong from weak student performance on national assessment. So there's something called the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And when you look at that, the difference between, if you think of sort of an open-ended question you might get on an assessment about a piece of reading you've done, that students that are able to answer those questions were scoring proficient, and students that weren't able to, they were able to do the multiple choice questions, but they weren't able to do the open-ended questions as much. So it really is a differentiator here in terms of the ability. And you can also imagine that being able to locate and deploy evidence are hallmarks of strong readers and writers. What are the implications for instruction? One is that what we need to do is make sure that students are able to make valid claims that square with the text evidence. The second is to ask questions that do not require information or evidence from outside the text. And I'm going to show you an example of that, or a couple examples so you can take a look at by that and why it's important. The other thing is to include effective sequences of questions that build on one another so students stay focused on the text and are actually able to learn from the text. So here's what we've been finding in resources and textbooks. I think they've been finding from some of the institutes that we did that people are seeing this in the adult ed resources as well. So non-text dependent questions are something like, oh, in Casey at bat, Casey strikes out, describe a time when you failed at something. You don't have to have read the text in order to be able to talk about when you failed at something, right? But what would be text dependent is to say, well, what makes Casey's experience that human? You think about the letter from Birmingham jail. Again, you might say, discuss a time when you wanted to fight against something that you felt was unfair, versus what can you infer from King's letter about the letter that he received. And then there's one there on Tom Sawyer, which is ask students to devise their own charm to remove warts, as in The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, which is a classic, versus why does Tom hesitate to allow Ben to paint the fence, and how does Twain construct his sentences to reflect that hesitation? What effect do Tom's hesitations have on Ben? So you can tell as you move from non-text dependent to text dependent that all the ones on the right require students to have actually read the text and understood the text in order to answer the question. Whereas the ones on the left take students immediately away from the text, so they don't have to have read it, or they could have skimmed it, and then their reading skills don't improve either. So we're just going to do, I think we're going to try to do a little survey here. We'll see if this works, a little poll here. So here are 3 prompts, and you can read through these, and then tell us which you think is the text-dependent one. We'll give you a couple minutes to read over the questions and then see which one you think it is. Mark in the poll. Marcella has changing their mind. Okay. Is there anybody else? Shall we? Okay. So you see here, okay, 1 didn't fool you. You're absolutely right. 2 is the text-dependent question. It's interesting about number 3 because I do see there's one person that thought, well, this could be text dependent, and it's partially text dependent. And I wanted to spend just a moment on that. Well, let me do number 2 first. It says, write an essay in which you describe this process and tell how the letter shows that this process is important to the civil rights movement. So obviously, you have to have read the letter, you have to have understood what Martin Luther King was telling us, the argument that he's making, and so on. So that's very definitely text dependent. The number 3 is write an essay in which you relate these goals to aspects of the modern day civil rights movement. Now, what that requires is some reliance on the so it's a little bit of a trick question. It does rely on the text. It does ask you to go outside the text, and it may be for very good reasons. So that's one of the reasons to have this question there, because if you were doing a unit on civil rights, and it could be, in a civics class or whatever, that you're really trying to say, sort of where we've been in the United States in terms of civil rights, and sort of tracing it and then figuring out where we are today and what's going on in some recent events around civil rights, which we certainly have been having them in the news. Then having an essay in which you relate the goals of the letter to some other things that you've read would very definitely be text dependent. If it's just on the letter itself, it does require students to go outside the text. But there is a place here when we're talking about knowledge building that eventually, a question like this could be very, very useful. So I'm glad somebody selected that one. The next one is to think about sort of the questions that require rigorous analysis of complex text. As part of what you want in a text-dependent question are to think about which are the questions that are really asking you to think and synthesize information. So just take a moment here, read through these 5, and then see which questions you think are the ones that are requiring the most rigorous analysis of complex text. Hey, well, you are all absolutely right, and I know if everybody spoke up, you would be able to say why, which is obviously what's happening in questions 3 and 4, is that they're asking students about the relationship between here the setting and the main event, or how these decisions to stay affected the outcome. So again, there's a relationship there. So that's one of the things that we're looking for too. Yes, we want the questions to be text dependent. We also want them to be valuable for students to be thinking about. So the next one, and then the last ELA literacy advance, is building knowledge through content-rich nonfiction. And so why is this important? Nonfiction is important. And actually, this is a place where I think that adult education has it way over the K-12 system. Because and you'll see this actually in the selection of the standards that were selected by the panels. They really emphasize nonfiction reading. That isn't always the case in K-12. The reason why is because nonfiction makes up the vast majority of our reading in college and the work. Love literature, and literature is important to have as well, but, or I should say, and most of the reading I know I do is nonfiction and the other thing we know from the research is that informational text is harder for students to comprehend than narrative text. We think about narrative text and we know that it follows sort of a storyline, right? There's a plot, there's a setting, there's characters, there's usually a conflict that happens, and then somehow that conflict gets resolved. So it follows a similar pattern, whereas informational text comes in all sort of shapes and structures, if you will. So it can be problem solution, it can be cause and effect, it can be straightforward point by point explanation, and it can also use a mix of structures. So we find that students have more trouble with informational text than they do with a piece of literature. And then the other thing is that this is, and the research really does come more from children about boys and girls, but that males tend to lag females in reading, and this may be changing with as as sort of gender equality continues to improve. Is that males tend to prefer reading informational text over narrative fiction. So there's another reason, sort of interest level, which we know really helps with students' access to complex text. So what are the implications for instruction? Well, the first is obviously the need to focus on content-rich informational text and curriculum. Again, I think this is a place where adult ed, and I'm really interested to hear from all of you if you feel this is true in programs that you're familiar with, but that to really focus on content-rich informational text. The second is to provide a coherent selections of strategically sequenced text, because this is how you build knowledge about a topic. There's also research out there that says, let's say you're going to read about the civil rights, or you're going to read about life cycles of animals or something like that. If you give students a sequence of texts that are about a particular subject area, a particular topic that is of interest and important about the world, then students' vocabulary, you can grow a student's vocabulary 4 times faster about if you with all the words that are coming in those texts, because students, as they understand the context that they're reading, let's say you're reading something about baseball and you read maybe a simpler text about baseball, and then you read a more complex one. You've already got sort of the context, you've got some of the lingo, you understand what's going on, and sort of in your brain essentially has built some knowledge around which then you can sort of hang on other knowledge. So that's something to think about in terms of putting instruction together. And the other thing is to always demand evidence in student writing. This was another place that the panel really felt strongly about the writing standards. In the Common Core, there are narrative writing standards and then ones to inform and explain and to argue. And the panel accepted some of the narrative writing in the early adult learning levels, but dropped narrative writing out in the later levels. I want to say it was from about the ABE3 level, maybe the ABE2 level on up. Really felt that demanding evidence in students' writings was really important to do. And then also thinking about conducting short research projects to answer a question. I think this has become even more important in terms of college and career readiness for students. We usually think about research projects as being this one thing you do, and and it's a big, huge project. But to think about more shorter research projects on a topic, having students gather resources, know how to search for information, knowing how to synthesize through those resources is a really important skill, it seems to me, especially with the internet, etc. So those all become implications for the instruction. So the 3 advances in ELA literacy boil down to text worth reading, questions worth answering, and work worth doing. Now, obviously, there are level-specific standards that give a progression of each one of these. But if you get a sense that these are the priorities in instruction, it really helps instructors focus on what they need to shift, if they need to shift at all. So I just want to give you, because the question comes up about the Common Core state standards and the college and career readiness standards, how do they compare? And I've given you some hints about this already. But one is that there are fewer standards than the Common Core, but the wording of the selected standards is identical. So the panel didn't fuss with, they sometimes wanted to fuss with the wording of the standard. They wanted to make it clear, or they liked part of the standard but not the whole of the Common Core standard. But we didn't want to get into rewriting or editing or refining the standard. So the standard was taken as a whole, or it wasn't taken at all. We did allow to drop off some of the examples, feeling like in some cases, if the example felt like it was, you could have had an adult example, but it was more childlike example, then those were dropped out. So the examples were dropped out if people were either good or relevant and so on, but the wording themselves was identical. Um, it was interesting because as they looked at the English language arts literacy standards from the Common Core, and there were grades 9, 10 standards, and there were grades 11, 12 standards. And overall, the panel felt, and I think they were right about this, is that the grade 11, 12 standards were generally, sometimes they selected one, but generally they felt they were a little too fancy by half. In other words, there was a progression, and because there needed to be a progression in the standards, there would be one more thing added to the grade 9, 10 standards, and the panel just felt like it was unnecessary. They did, as I said, focus mainly on the informational text standards. They did include some literature standards, but mainly focused on the informational text standards. And the place where we had the biggest debate, and the only place we took an actual vote on the panel was in the Common Core State Standards. There are some specific content, and it's namely the seminal U.S. documents. And there was a vote, and the panel felt like those were important documents for adult students to have access to be able to spend some time with. And you'll see that some of the assessments are actually picking up some of those. So like the College Board, for example, entry exam, those are using some of the seminal docs. Some of the consortia tests that are going to be available for adults to take as well, we'll use them in the GED as well. So there this was a place where some folks thought, don't get into content, but it was in the Common Core State Standards, and they thought it was important for adult students. One place we had a vote. The other thing, as I suggested, is that expository writing was accentuated. So narrative writing is in the early levels, and we had levels A, B, C, D, E, but they put them in the early levels. But in the higher levels, once I know you're getting up to sort of the ABE 3 on up, narrative writing dropped out, and expository writing itself was accentuated. So if you're thinking about, well, what does this mean we do? I have sort of top 10 actions to take in the area of ELA literacy. So the first is to take a complexity inventory of what your students are reading at each level, and then make some adjustments if you need to. I should tell you that we are speaking to the STAR folks, and we had some of the STAR folks actually on our panel, so they were there when we were doing this, just to make sure that the definition in the CCR, because there is a staircase of complexity that's included, and there's actually sort of a definition by the sort of quantitative measures of what it means to be complex at each level, to make sure that we're all in sync so we aren't driving people nuts. So we'll be having those conversations. But there is a sense that this is likely maybe a place too where adult education may surpass K-12 as well. As students enter into ABE 3, they're doing ABE 3 reading. You've given them an assessment, so now you know they're ready for ABE 3. But it's good to take a look at the inventory and look at the quantitative measures against what students have been reading, because there has been a step up, if you will, in terms of what's required in order to close that 4-year gap. Ask students to stretch to read more complex text, especially short text beyond their reading level. So, and I say with support. So one of the things that teachers are having with is providing students not with an 100-page, complex text that is quote unquote over their reading level, but something that's a page or 2 pages, and then working with that student or those students on that piece, sort of chunking the text, reading it together, doing some peer review of it, etc. Because we're finding that as students stretch to read more complex text, they're getting access to complex syntax, they're getting access to the complex vocabulary they need to, getting access to the concepts they need to learn. So that's something to think about. The other thing is to teach students to read strategically, to slow down, to understand key points, and to reread passages. So I think one of the things, that I know that I'm hearing from around the country from students of sort of all ages and all sorts of classes and courses is that finally they're not racing through text or skimming through text, that they're actually languishing or around a text for more than just an hour or something like that. That they're really trying to understand what it is the author's saying, and really work through that. The other, as I said, is to focus on academic vocabulary. So this is in addition to domain-specific vocabulary. For every text a student reads, that there should be some focus on the academic vocabulary words in the text, especially those that are crucial to the meaning, because that's how students build vocabulary, is a lot of times in context and seeing it again and again. The other one is to place a premium on student stamina and persistence. I think this is something for all of us who teach and have taught, that it's sometimes hard, and we worry if students are struggling to read something or to write something, and we don't want something that is so out of the realm for a particular student or set of students, but we do want productive struggle. And there is something, if we think about our own lives, about if we're struggling to understand something, as long as it's productive struggle, that there's something where when I then am able to do it, I feel good about myself. I have more confidence in myself, and I've also learned something. So to allow students and to teach them really about stamina and persistence, and this is actually as important in math as it is in ELA literacy. So number 6 is provide texts that are valuable sources of information and provide opportunities for students to gain knowledge from careful reading. If you're going to ask students to spend time with reading, then the selection of those readings needs to be thought out carefully. So if in the resources that students have, if you feel like that richer texts are available on a particular topic students are reading, then look to supplement those texts. Evidence, evidence, evidence. So when you think about students reading, asking them really good text-dependent questions about a text, and if you've added another text on the topic, then you might ask them some comparison contrast questions, or what you've now learned from the new text you've done, but to always be thinking about questions that require students to have read carefully the text and to provide evidence from the text. And just to say, because sometimes people get confused, the notion of text dependent doesn't mean that it's an explicit question. So it doesn't mean, what is the color of, the character's raincoat or something like that. I mean, you could ask a question like that. Maybe it's relevant and maybe somehow it's crucial, but you're really talking about questions that ask students to make an inference that's square with the evidence. Ask students to engage in written and oral arguments and discussions about everything they read, and everything they research. Probably should have added there too. This is something that we've heard from both college faculty and from employers about, that they are really argument cultures in a good way. So we're talking about being able to build an argument, make a claim, gather your evidence, put it together in a way that's organized that people can understand it. And this is something that you can do, and actually with some of the folks that attended the Institute had actually begun to do some of this as they looked at some of the resources they were using, and were working to substitute text-dependent questions for non-text dependent questions in existing material. You would be surprised, and have not done a survey of adult ed resources. It's something that we're likely to do in a project that I'm working on. Begin to take a really close look at what's there, but I can tell you that in the look at K-12 materials, that anywhere from 30 to 70% of the questions are non-text, and most of the questions that ask students to write tend to be non-text dependent. And these are so this notion about substituting text-dependent questions for non-text dependent questions, because we know that resources can be tight. The passages or the text themselves might be just fine. They might be rich and wonderful, but the questions are what you need to attend to. And the last one is to ensure the alignment of the materials. So teachers the teachers use by tying the purchasing of materials to the key shifts. So you're looking for materials that are attending to the text complexity requirements of college and career readiness standards, that they have text-dependent questions, or at least a lot of text-dependent questions that they tie with it, and that they're offering passages on a topic, a series of passages on a topic, or you can always supplement the text, but that the students are able to build their knowledge. So now I'm just going to pause for some questions before we move on to math. Anything I said that...
Thanks, Susan. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to put those directly into the chat pod, and we can ask Susan to respond to those that way. Okay, it looks like we don't have any questions right at the moment. So if you want to go ahead.
See that, and if something occurs to somebody along the way, or just go ahead and type it in, and we'll I'll stop and answer it, because something might occur to you as I do math. So the CCR standards for adult education in mathematics. So they too have 3 key advances, 3 key instructional advances prompted by the CCR. One is to focus strongly where the standards focus. Coherence, and that's designing learning around coherent progressions, level to level, also within a level, but we're going to talk mainly about level to level. And then rigor, and I know we use the word rigor a lot. In the case of the college and career readiness standards, what they mean is pursuing conceptual understanding, procedural skill and understanding, and fluency and application, all with equal intensity. But you need all 3 of those as you move. So the first one, focus strongly where the CCR standards focus. Well, why is that relevant and important based on the research? High-performing nations significantly narrow the scope of content so that students can focus their time and energy on the major work of the level. So if you think about high-performing nations, that there's like the TIMSS assessment, that a lot of PISA assessments that they take, that high-performing nations, when you go back to look at their standards, tend to narrow the scope of what's taught each year, or in this case, we'll say each level for adult education, so that students are able to really concentrate and focus their time and energy. I'm sure all of you have heard, a mile wide and an inch deep. And what this attempts to do, when you think about the research, is to make it sort of a mile deep and an inch wide. So students come in, if they've studied at the ABE2 level, they come in with a deep understanding of what you needed them to learn, and then they have a sound foundation upon which to build. And so the research shows that very clearly. The top performing nations around the world, they tend to do that, whereas in the United States, we tended not to do that before the college and career readiness standards. So by focusing deeply on what's emphasized, it sort of makes sort of common sense. Then students are able to gain strong foundations, so that teachers and instructors don't feel like they've got to go back over content that students haven't learned before. And identifying concepts that support the major concepts of the level will create a coherent flow of knowledge and skills within the level. So there's a sense of really focusing in here that's important. So the implications for instruction. So focus where the CCR standards focus means that some content is more important than other content. And you can actually see in the CCR standards, what really is most important. There's some paragraphs that come in front of the college and career readiness standards, each one of the at each one of the levels, which talks about what's most important for students to learn. And I think about this as being such a great assist to adult education programs, assist overall, but it's certainly an assist to adult education programs who, with adult students who come in, and they don't have 13 years, most of them, to learn the content. So what is most important for them to learn? How much time do they have? And where do I, as the instructor, spend the time with them? So it really does narrow but deepen the scope, and it really shows, as someone once put, the power of the eraser, that it isn't always teaching a whole lot more, but teaching what's most important well. And there's the notion of the mile wide and inch deep that I just went over. And focusing really strengthens understanding on a sort of a fewer topics on the list, meaning that you can spend a whole lot more time on each one. And you can imagine that that's both helpful to students and to instructors. And then other content, because what I want you to understand is in the adult education code for readiness standard, not all the content that was selected would be considered the major work of the level. So they picked from the Common Core State Standards, they picked what they thought was an important subset. And then this notion of focusing on the major work of the level is yet another subset. So the next, which is connected to focus, but extends, if you will, the notion of focus, is designing learning around the coherent progressions level to level. So what does this mean and why is this important? And some of this, again, is sort of common sense. But obviously, coherence allows students to demonstrate new understanding built on foundations from previous study. If you think about the study of mathematics, you think about it as being a coherent discipline. And it also prevents standards from being an isolated list of topics. So, and that's another reason why the standards themselves shouldn't be looked at as a checklist, or I'm going to do this standard on this day and I'm going to do another standard on another day, because what you really want to do is organize content around the major work of the level, and then have the other standards come in and support. Coherence also means that each standard is not a new event, but an extension of previous learning. So less time needs to be spent on reteaching. And that becomes, again, really key for adult students and really key for their instructors. So implications for instruction. So lessons should build new understanding on foundations based on previous lessons. So the content unfolds meaningfully. Again, one of the things that we sometimes hear, and I've heard this both from adult educators and from K-12 educators, is I feel like I'm spending so much time going back over what I thought my students came in already knowing or should have already known. Explicit connections between concepts should be made in lessons across the levels, but also within each level. There's something about the reinforcing nature of one concept with another concept. If we think about how we learn, that if it's a bunch of sort of disconnected topics, it doesn't hang together. I probably can't remember it for more than a day, if that. But when learning comes on top of other learning, and it reminds me of what I've learned before, I learn it better, and I tend to remember it. The other thing is, again, that students and teachers should begin to expect that knowledge and skills are going to grow. And I think students can see where they've been and then also where they're going, so they don't feel like things are disconnected and a new. I just wanted to show you something from Bill McCallum. He was the lead writer of the Math Common Core State Standards, just as a way of thinking about the CCR domains and how sort of what becomes a major emphasis, and where some of that emphasis drops off. As you can begin to see here about counting and cardinality, obviously most of our adults will come in knowing that. But then you think about numbers and operations as being really key, and then moving into the number system. And then as you begin to see the notion of algebra, algebraic thinking, and expressions and equations, and then up into algebra, you see ratios and proportions, which we hear are so key from mathematicians about students' abilities to really understand and be able to think. And still key, as we know, in terms of college readiness, that there's a real emphasis on those as students get into sort of that ABE 3 level. So I want to show you that. So the third advance is thinking about the notion of procedural skill and fluency, conceptual understanding, and application, all with equal intensity. So why is this important? And this is the place where the math wars are, I think, for those of you who have stayed attuned to those or know those, and they still sort of pop up to some extent, is that some are all the way over on conceptual understanding, which is really important because then if students understand what they're doing and why they're doing it, they can generalize it and apply it. If students but if they don't know how to, actually perform the calculations and they don't know how to do it fluently, then they oftentimes aren't good problem solvers because they've got to kind of go back and it becomes some laborious task and things don't come really quickly. And then students also need to be able to apply their mathematics, right, to things that matter, to a wide variety and types of problems. And one of the things that we know, having looked at some of the adult education standards and it's some of the resources, which isn't unlike some of the K-12, is a real focus on procedural competency, if you will, less so on conceptual understanding, and maybe not as much on application as there needs to be. So what does this mean for instruction? So rigor in lesson relates to the depth at which the major work of each level should be addressed. So again, we're focusing in on the content. We want a coherent progression of content, but there's also a depth issue here. So lessons need to help students understand the key concepts, right? And see math as more than a set of discrete procedures. So that really is what we're talking about when we get to conceptual understanding and making sure that our teaching does that and our resources support us in doing that. That some class time and homework should be devoted to students' practice with calculations and mathematical procedures so they can gain speed and accuracy and confidence. And that fluency practice itself is critical, but it also needs to support problem solving and deeper mathematical thinking. It sort of answers the question, well, why are we bothering with this? Why are we bothering to learn this? Well, it's because I can apply it to something that's important. So when we think about those being an equal intensity, it just means that when you're thinking about a particular concept that students are learning, that they that they understand it, that they have some fluency with it, and that they're able to then apply it and given good problems in which to apply it, which then teaches them more. I also want to talk about the standards for mathematical practice. This is not an advance in itself. These kinds of mathematical practices have been around for a while, but it's really important as you understand the standards themselves, the College of Caribbean standards. There are the standards for mathematical content, and there are the standards for mathematical practice. The standards for mathematical content are level specific. So they start from, we call it level A, level B, level C, level D, level E, which level E is like your adult secondary education. And the level A is your beginning level in adult education. The standards for mathematical practice are meant to go across the levels. So there isn't like, you don't look at ABE 3 and there's not a new writing of making sense of problems or reasoning abstractly and quantitatively. And the reason for that is that the practices are meant to be applied to the content. And it's important that in order to really have rigor, that needs to be part of what you think about in any sort of lesson. So why is it important? Well, obviously, as you look back, I'll just look back for 1 second here. When you think about these, it's making sense of problems, reasoning abstractly, constructing viable arguments, critiquing the reasoning of others, using appropriate tools, modeling with mathematics, attending to precision. So a lot of these have been around for a long time, as we've said, but there's sort of a new emphasis on them as we think about making students ready for and preparing students for college already. So as I said, they describe the expertise that students need to have at all levels. And when concepts and skills, if you think about the skills of mathematical practice are also connected to the practices, then deeper understanding can occur and allow students to extend them to new situations. If they are able to speak about and talk about and explain the reasoning or critique the reasoning of others, or they know how to use a tool strategically, all that becomes really important as they move on to college and careers. And the emphasis on the practice really shift the focus, if you will, from just how do I get the answer, knowing the procedure right, maybe even understanding the concept to also learning how to learn. And so it's important to think about as students put, as instructors put lessons together, to think about that. So the standards for mathematical practice are meant to be applied across all levels, so you need to think about that. And that not all standards for mathematical practice are appropriate for every lesson. So you really need to think about what should the focus be on those practices that are central to the lesson. And if you're getting to, if you've got two, maybe three of the practices, you're probably in the right ballpark, sort of 1 to 3. If you're getting over that number, you probably aren't really focusing on the mathematical practice as much as you should be. It might be touching on a mathematical practice, but if it's really not a focus of the lesson, then it's better not to put it in as the students are actually getting practice. It's really important to make sure that over the course of students' study, let's say at ABE2 or ABE3 or at ASE, that they are experiencing all the standards for mathematical practice over the course of the unit or the level of study, because that will be important again for their preparation. So now just to think about a little bit about the Common Core State Standards and the CCR standards in mathematics and how they compare. So one of the things that may be of great relief to those of you who are looking at the College and Career Readiness standards is there are many fewer standards at the ASC level. So only about 31% of the Common Core State Standards at the ASC level, at level E, were selected. So they greatly narrowed the number of standards, the quantity of standards that they thought were most relevant and important to. And you should know that they drew most of the CCR standards from the domains of algebra and functions. And I also just want to say, as you look at the standards, and if you look at the level D standards for adult education students, and you look at the level E standards, there is a lot of similarity. The level E standards go a step further, and there is something in the College and Career Readiness standards for adult education that shows the connection between the ABE3 or level D standards, if you will, and the level E standards, so that you can see that while they seem to mimic one another, there is something that's happening at the high school level or at the adult secondary level that is more challenging. But the other thing to know is there is challenging content, perhaps more challenging content than your instructors are used to at the ABE3 level if they're following the College and Career Readiness standards. The other thing to know, and I know that there are some adult education programs that want to be able to prepare their students for STEM. The panel did not include the STEM standards. There are 54 STEM standards from the Common Core. It's not that a state couldn't include them and decide they want to include those as well. The panel just felt that for relevance and importance for all students, that the STEM standards sort of went way beyond. And in fact, in the Common Core standards, they are marked with asterisks or some such thing, some mark like that, to show that, again, those aren't relevant and important to all students as well. Again, in the College and Career Readiness report, if you're interested in the STEM standards, we have a section in the report that that outlines them. So if you're looking for an easy way to pull STEM standards into your standards, they're there for easy use. So I just wanted to finish off, and you have obviously can have copies of this to show you where there's some good math resources for you. So just to go over just a couple of them here, Engage New York. Now these are in New York State got a Race to the Top grant, and they put together, they hired vendors with a lot of teacher support in putting together lessons and units, both in math and in ELA literacy. Some of them will be relevant for adult students. Some of them will obviously be too childlike, but it's a good resource and one you may want to draw from if you're looking for lessons and units. There's something called Illustrative Mathematics. This is again run by Bill McCallum. You see him down there under the progressions document as well. And Illustrative Mathematics, again, is sort of run for and by educators from around the nation. And they're working on problems, good problem sets that align to standards. So it's a resource you could go in. Remember, we were just talking about the notion of rigor and good application problems that you can go on to illustrative math and look for math problems that that align. And then there are these other resources here. I'll zip down to Achieve the Core, which is part of a nonprofit that I am a co-founder of, and there are resources there to help you think about implementing standards both in math and and then the ELA resources, again, as I talked about, Engage New York, the Student Achievement Partners Achieve the Core set that has some close reading exemplars with text-dependent questions. It's got some fluency resources on it. There's also a observation protocol if you're looking to see if the advances are actually occurring in classrooms, and this is something that teachers can use themselves as sort of their own self-assessment. So there are lots of resources as you move down this list. Some of these have like ReadWorks and has a lot of non-fiction reading in what we might call text sets called Navigating Text Complexity, which has been put together by a consortium of states to help demystify the what does it mean by text complexity, how do we figure it out, what should we pay attention to. So there's sort of a raft of resources there for you as well. And we certainly hope to build some more as I work on the implementing college and career readiness as we move forward with states that are going to be implementing standards in deep ways. We hope to be able to add to this complement. With that, I am done and glad to take any questions or comments people may want.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much for that, Susan. I think that was a wonderful presentation, and I know that I personally learned so much from it. I do want to open it up now to questions. If you have any that you would like to ask Susan, please type them into the chat pod, and we'll have her ask or respond to those questions now. We have some time, so we can. Please do feel free to ask her any questions that you have. One question, Susan, that I know is very important for all of our participants and for anyone who in California will be listening to this webinar in the future is how we can use these standards in an ESL context, given that so many programs in California do have a significant number of ESL students.
Yeah, so let me spend a little time on that and also send you to a resource called the Understanding Language Project that comes right out of Stanford. And the standards can be used and applied in to English language learners, students. As if you look at what is on, and I participated in this project, the Understanding Language Project, they feel that giving students access to complex text is important. And many EL experts were saying that they're tired of sort of the mush they get from publishers that their EL students are able to ask. So if you look at the Understanding Language Project, interesting unit on, and this is about sort of ABT. Well, it would be ESL, wouldn't it be? ESL 3 level students, but students that might be reading at that level. They are bringing students into complex text in a variety of ways. They might show students, they were doing something on the Civil War and then asking students to read, ESL students to read Abraham Lincoln's along with some other texts. And they actually started with some pictures of the Civil War because, again, these would be English language learning students that maybe don't know the history, understandably, of United States and what happened. And then they start with some very simple text on Lincoln, on what was happening, on the Civil War, and move students up as sort of, if you might call it, about sort of gradated text way where students then are beginning to read simple passages. And remember, I talked about a sequence of text where then students are into the context, they understand the and they're having great success with this, by the way. So these are taking the standards as they are, but then applying them to English language learners. There is also a framework and I should get that to you, Marcella, and I
That'd be great.
facilitated the group, which was talking about, well, what are some of the major emphases, if you will, on in the science literacy standards, in the math standards, in the English language literacy area, and what does that mean in terms of our teaching our English language learners? And there are some cultural changes or shifts that one has to make. For example, the notion of argument is one in some cultures that would seem offensive, and so to understand that and be able to make the shift. And I also have a paper that I wrote. I was the least skilled in this area, but with two English language learner experts that talked specifically about the literacy standards and where were the challenges and where were the opportunities. And I'd be glad to get you a copy of that, Marcella, for your folks to be able to look at. So this is something that I think that the English language learner community has both excited about and don't want their students to be left out of being prepared for college and careers. So there are there are obviously supports that are that may be different than for students who know the language already, but they're also what they call language minority students that were born here, lived here, and still can't read or write very well. And some of these strategies are
Great, thanks. Susan, you seem to be cutting in and out a little bit.
Is this
I don't know
better?
if you have yourself. That's much better. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. And Susan, I see here that we have a question from Andre asking about what has been done to create a repository of best practices since the CCRS trainings.
Yeah. So we're going to be doing that, Andre, in our next iteration where there will be states will be able to apply for really in-depth work, implementation work, and part of what we're going to do in that will be looking at instructional resources. We'll be looking at lessons, lesson design. We'll be looking at student assignments, and we'll be looking at a good tool, observation tool, self-assessment tool for instructors to see that they're making the shifts that they want to make. And so we expect to be able to put up and from these adult education programs from these 12 states a repository of best practice and begin to do that because it's really important. From the institutes themselves, we have some anecdotes and some things that folks are trying, but they had just most of the folks that came were just beginning to get into implementation. But we hope to do that, and your challenge is a good one because it's really important that we get in and get resources. I know we heard from the institutes that it's really important for people to be able to look at their resources.
Susan, I'm sorry. Can you repeat that? You're breaking up again.
Okay, sorry. I don't know why. So is this better?
Yes, that's better.
I'm kind of hanging on to it, so I'll put it even closer to my mouth. So we're going to be, I know one of the things we heard from the institutes, Andre, in particular, is being able to have resources that teachers and instructors can teach from. And on the first workshop that we're going to do is going to be explicitly on doing that, looking at adult education resources, figuring out where they are, how on particular, particular evaluation, and then seeing if there are ways for us to improve them. And then we want to be able to offer, and then they'll work on these as they go home, because you can't do it all in a couple of days, and then hope to be able to offer those resources to the field across the nation. We've got to be able to find ways to do that, but there are ways to do it. And that seems to be a key need. So stay tuned for that.
Great, thank you. Then we have a question from Mary about math. If there are areas that come to mind that we should spend less time on.
Yeah, so how do I want to say this? Early on, if you're building a foundation in math, it's really critical that students, have their foundations in number sense, ratios, proportion. Without sort of a solid foundation on that, students aren't going to be able to progress in algebra where they need to. So it's really number sense and measurement are what you want to focus on. So what takes a back seat until students get into some higher levels of mathematics would be something like probability. That rather than doing, so what I want to say is, instead of doing all the domains where we think about them as number, geometry, measurement, algebra, statistics, and probability, that there's sort of less on the probability area than there would have been in the past. That comes in, though, in the higher levels. So it isn't that statistics and probability isn't important. It's just that until students have the foundations, it's better to spend more time on number sense and some notions about expressions and equations as students move up, and then work on sort of this notion of statistics and probability as students move into the higher levels of mathematics.
Great, thank you. And then we had another question about how basic skills programs in community colleges are utilizing the CCRS, if you have any information on that.
I don't know exact. I mean, I would be able to tell you a little bit of ad hoc, in that in the institutes we did have some community colleges that were well represented and were thinking about using the CCR as their standard. So I would imagine they would be then tying. And when you say basic skills programs, are you talking about sort of remedial? I'm thinking you're talking about remedial. Is that right, Andre?
Andre, if you can just type
yes or no
into the chat pod.
I think I'll give a broader answer, because what I want to say is that community college programs are paying attention. We had some come to the institutes. Of course, every state sort of has its own. Sometimes community college are actually delivering adult education, and sometimes it's sort of they're co-delivering in some respects. And I think there is a great interest, because there's a sense of what is it that our students need so that they can succeed in college. So I think we have had interest from community colleges, and I think we will continue to.
Okay, great, thanks. And Andre, if that didn't sufficiently answer your question, please feel free to type in some more for more clarification. Marianne asked, what advice or examples of effective practice can you share about support programs needs and the steps they can take to implement the standards?
Yeah, so I think, well, one of the things that I think that if programs are going to implement the standards, they need to give teachers and instructors time to work together. And because I think that asking every teacher or instructor to do this by himself or herself, I just think won't work. and they don't have time. And I know time to meet is sometimes hard too because you have people that are in part-time, oftentimes part-time instructors, not always, but sometimes, and that becomes hard. But I also think that the way to do this is together. I think focusing on the actual work that instructors have to do. So if I were planning an implementation program, I would really focus in on the key advances. This is something that people are doing around the country because sometimes if you focus only on a 80-page document, if you will, that seems to have standards and more standards and more standards, that it's easier for me to think about how I'm going to apply the standards or implement the standards within this notion about what we know needs to change in instruction. So as people focus in on, well, what are my students reading and what is the complexity of that and the quality of those readings? When I look at the resources, so I would really want to make it concrete for instructors. So it's not just the theory of what's important, but also something that you can actually give me in my classroom with my students to actually use or have me develop with others that I can use that will actually get my students to where they need to go according to the standards. So I would concentrate on the shifts or the advances, the three advances, and then I would work on really concrete parts of the program so that instructors immediately have what they need, or at least some of what they need, in order to teach in a classroom. And then I also think we need to give instructors time to watch each other instructing. And again, I know some of this is challenging. It's challenging in K-12. I think oftentimes when I've heard adult educators is they sometimes feel like they're sort of siloed off on their own. They come in at a certain time and they teach their class and they go, and they sort of never see anybody else, or no one comes into their classroom, or they don't get to go into anybody else's classroom. So I think some of that sort of getting together, putting a lesson together, having somebody teach it, having somebody watch it, I think is really important.
Great, thank you. Now, are there other ways that you envision ESL educators combining language teaching and language teaching methodology with teaching text complexity, evidence, and knowledge?
So the answer to that is yes. I think that, I mean, it's one of the things that the framework does that I can give to you is that to look at the way one sets up the classroom and what one prioritizes. Let's talk about it in terms of language, right? So if it's really important, I talked about research being important, right? It's important in all of our lives. It'll be important in college and careers. That's sort of one example. One way to kind of combine sort of ESL teaching with research is to allow students to do some reading and some research in their own language, and then begin to move so they understand something about the topic that they're researching, and then begin to move that into English so that they can use. So part of what we want to do is be able to use the skills and the knowledge and the richness of the cultures of the English language learners that are coming in, and sort of depend on those, if you will, rely on those as you then concentrate on what are some of the key aspects of the college and career readiness standards, like research, like building arguments, or even doing those within verbally, concentrating on text, if you will. So I think there are some ways to be able to take the standards, provide extra supports, rely on the expertise and the talents that the students bring themselves from their first language, and bring that into the college and readiness standards.
Great, thank you. Sorry. And I was wondering, how do you see, or are there any special suggestions that you have for teachers who are working in CTE programs who are looking to really integrate some more of these standards and academics into their classroom.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I would say one of the things, if I were to think about, I'll just do the area that I'm in, which is sort of English language arts literacy. When you think about, I mean, I would, if I were in a CTE course, I wouldn't be using literature, right? I'd want to be using the the informational text that students will be using in the particular career. And so, goodness knows, I mean, that some of the technical texts are some of the toughest around. I would also, and you will see some of this in the College and Career Readiness Standards, where, for example, the panel pulled in from the science literacy, science and technical learning literacy, and from the social studies literacy. They pulled in some standards that deal with quantitative literacy. Um, they that really important of the ability to be able to synthesize information that comes in a chart with information that comes as text, um, information that comes in a variety of ways, because that's oftentimes in our careers or what we need to do. And so the panel thought it was really important to bring those kinds of things in. If I was doing some writing, you'll also see sort of in the writing standards there that there is a way to write when you're doing technical writing. And again, the panel really zeroed in on the information writing and the argument writing, but there are aspects to writing a technical text or a career text um, that are really well in line with that, but there were some specific kinds of things that you'd bring in for technical writing. So I would say that the ELA literacy standards work really well in a career technical arena, provided that the kind of reading you're doing, the kind of writing you're doing, the kind of speaking and listening you're doing is all around preparing you for a particular career. I'd also just say on the math side that, again, thinking about the kind of math that's health professional, or you're going to be in the computer trade or internet trade or the software trade, that again, thinking about backing up from those careers and thinking about the kinds of math that are required in order to really move up in those careers, is to be thinking about then really selecting out the math that's most important for those careers.
Great, thank you. Catherine was wondering if you can recommend any good videos that show teachers implementing CCR standards aligned instruction with their students. And I know that adult ed might not be possible, but ideally in adult ed context,
Yeah,
a lot of our
so
teachers,
there
it's easier if they can see it.
I know, and that's no doubt. There are some, and I can head you in the direction of not adult ed context, but I can send you in the result of in the high school teaching, and also teaching very varied classes. So these are students that in many cases are low income, majority minority classes in high school, so you can actually watch the teaching occur there. It's not as good as in an adult ed context. We just aren't there yet. So by the way, if you know of any instructors who have actually made the move and they're good and can tell me about it, I'd love to know. We'll be looking for that as we move into the next phase of the implementing college and career ready standards. We don't have that yet, but I can help you with high school ed and varied classes so that you can take a look at what some teachers are doing there. And I'll be glad to get that to you too.
Wonderful, thank you. I really appreciate that. I just want to pause in case anyone has any final questions.
And I owe you all now.
Don't
You asked
see anyone.
questions. I owe you all now. I was going to say I owe you some good information that I will be sending on to Marcella.
Wonderful. Yes, and we'll be sure to send that along to the field as well. Okay, well, since I don't see any typing and it seems like we have no more questions, I want to thank you, yet again, Susan, for a wonderful, very informative presentation. And I want to thank all of you who participated as well. Before you do sign off, I want to direct you to the bottom of your screen. We have there links to our evaluation, and if you're interested in receiving a certificate of attendance, we would love for you to fill out the evaluations so that we can get feedback. That's the only way that we can improve our webinars. And if you would like a certificate of attendance after you evaluate the session, please email Chris Peppers, and her email address is provided below. So thank you again. Thank you, Susan. I think, Andre, if you email Chris, then we can try to get you a copy of that presentation if you're interested. And as Catherine says in the chat pod, we'll be posting the recording to our video library. So that will be available for you there as well. And with that, thank you so much to everyone, and we hope you'll join us for our next webinar in our series. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Susan. Thank you, Marcella.